privacy-sensitive matter. There can be million and million of reasons why individuals do not want to disclose their gender. The best known one is probably women developers who are not disclosing their gender due to safety concerns, but there might be more reasons. Open source projects and companies might be reluctant to disclose gender composition of their teams, for instance, because they might be less gender diverse than they would like us to believe. This being said, both Katie has mentioned yesterday experience from the Linux Foundation, and there is similar positive experience from the OpenStack Foundation, where gender reports have been requested, where gender reports have been written, and when gender reports have actually been used. So let us start with
switch your mic out.
yeah, sorry. Opla. Too many things connected.
You?
Yep, thank you, Emerson. Okay, so let us start by trying to understand how we can ask people about gender. So in 2004, Norman Bradburn and his co-authors have published this guide to questionnaire design. And it has been a highly influential guide. And in general, I do recommend you to check it. And it has been applied for all kinds of questionnaires in all kinds of application areas. But when it comes to gender, then essentially the recommendation is to ask, what is your sex? And the options are male and female. So it's 2004, it's 15 years ago. And here we see at least two problems. So first of all, gender is being conflated with sex. And second, you have only two options. However, recent surveys from Stack Overflow and GitHub show that between 0.7 and 0.9% of software developers do not necessarily identify as women or as men. And it might appear as a relatively small percentage. After all, it's less than 1%. But this being said, the prevalence of in those individuals in the software development community is at least twice as high as compared to the US population in general. So whenever we are asking about software developers about gender, we need to provide them with means of indicating that they are neither women nor men. So this would be one of the options. Here we have indeed three options. Unfortunately, this is also not a perfect solution. So this particular kind of questions have been heavily criticized for othering people. Essentially, this question suggests that there are two major genders, and then there is the rest. This is not the feeling you want to give your respondents, because they might be less inclined to answer the follow-up questions. So this is why in 2012, Greta Bauer has proposed a slightly modified version of this question, where instead of the word other, there is a more refined phrasing, something else, specify. So unfortunately, my favorite survey organizing platform, which is Google Forms, does not support this kind of questions, because it does not allow one to combine multiple choice questions with open answer unless it's the other version. There is a more profound issue with this question, namely that it's not capable of distinguishing between transfeminine and transmasculine respondents. So just to be clear, transfeminine respondents are individuals which have been assigned male at birth and currently identify as women or as non-binary. And by the same token, transmasculine have been assigned female at birth and currently identify either as men or as non-binary. And you see here that both transfeminine and transmasculine respondents essentially choose all possible options. And if this question is used during an interview, then it turns out to be quite cognitively taxing to the interviewees. And the reason is that, first of all, it is not really clear what this question is about. Is it about gender identity, or is it about sex which has been assigned at birth? This means that ultimately the respondents are trying to guess the intention of the interviewer and ultimately reach different conclusions. So a slightly different approach has been advocated by the Genius Group, and it's 2014. So you see here that trans options have been separated into separate options. So like there is no question, what do you really mean? Because it's essentially related to gender identity. But the phrasing of this question immediately suggests that trans women are not really women, which is and will be experienced as offensive. And this is why the Open Demographics Project has decided to separate the two. So in the Open Demographics Project, if you look at the upper part of the slide, you have a question about being or not being trans, the next one about being or not being gender non-conforming, intersex is something completely different we are not really talking about currently, and then the gender spectrum identification has a long list of options. So good news. First of all, instead of male and female, this list refers to women and men. So it puts stress on the identity as opposed to on biological sex. Another good news, we can indicate multiple options. Please note, check all that apply. So an individual, for instance, can say, I'm a woman and a non-binary person, rather than I'm a woman or a non-binary person. Again, individual can decide not to answer at all or to provide a gender they prefer to identify themselves. Bad news is, however, this is a very long list. Usually, when we are trying to study software developers, we don't want to study gender as a single purpose of the study. We want to understand experiences of people of different genders within the software engineering context. So after this question, you need to imagine there will be a whole bunch of questions related to software engineering. So to struggle through this long list, respondents have to take quite some time and decide what to answer. It can even compromise the reliability of the results, because if the answer options are not clear, they might trigger answers which are not really corresponding to reality. And I have to say, I'm doing my very best to keep up with this kind of lists, but every single time I am seeing the new iteration, I have to look up at least some words on the list. So we cannot just assume that people will know what to choose. So this is why the HCI guidelines for gender equality, and Anita, thank you very much for pointing my attention to this document, essentially recommends to ask about gender by an open question. Of course, the problematic side of the story comes on our side, on the side of the researcher who has to somehow manually analyze those answers. Personally, I don't think that coding is such a big deal here, because usually software engineering surveys are not that big. We're talking about 100, maybe a couple of hundred respondents. We're not talking about millions. But if for whatever reasons we want to ask a broader population, then the very same HCI guideline suggests the following schema. And again, we see here the main advantages from the open demographics, right? It's a choice for women or men instead of female, male, check all that apply, ability, right to not to disclose gender or to identify in any other way. Again, because we are talking about minorities, the number of people who will be likely to indicate the last option will be small. So technically speaking, the coding problem is not so bad. However, whatever kind of questions we want to ask, whatever questions whether it's a survey, of course, an interview, we are limited by the number of people we can talk to. And different software engineering surveys tend to have a relatively low response rate. Most of the software engineering surveys I have seen that have been conducted on the open source data hit the bar of 10–20%. Of course, for company-based surveys, and I'm looking at Emerson, I'm looking at Andy, you guys usually would get much higher response rates. But still, so just to give you an impression, tomorrow Bogdan is probably going to talk about one of our recent works, where we have studied GitHub repositories of approximately 60,000 people. Half of them have been identified as women, half of them have been identified as men. If this is what we want, and we have 10 to 20% response rates, and we need to start sending mails to 300,000 people, 600,000 people, and if I'm going to ask 600,000 people, and you are going to ask 600,000 people, then we are essentially going to fatigue our wonderful respondents, which will simply not give us any answers. So, enter automatic gender inference tools. So all those tools are essentially based on an assumption that by analyzing attributes related to self-presentation or by analyzing attributes related to the artifacts created, we can infer gender. And this assumption, in a certain way, is very natural because this is how we as human beings operate. We look at how somebody presents, and we interpret their gender correctly or incorrectly, but this interpretation process is very much a part of how we are operating now. Maybe, I don't know, in 100 years, people will be operating in a different way, but now we are, this is what we do. Again, in one of the previous studies with Bogdan, with Vladimir and Prem, Prem was here. We have observed that gender is one of the most observable attributes within GitHub teams. Essentially, when you ask people on a GitHub team, what do you know about your teammates? Then, of course, the most obvious feature is a technical skill, but the second one would be gender. And this would be, for instance, higher than whatever, political preference, for instance. So most of the gender detection tools or gender guessing tools should be essentially labeled as name to gender. Here you see part of the European map showing names which are most frequently used by men and women in the responding countries. And you see that those lists are pretty different in a sense that when you are looking at a name, you can guess the gender of the individual involved. And in some countries, this relation between name and gender is even described in laws and legal procedures. This is, for instance, the case for Belgium, the country where I live. So the law in Belgium says that a name of a newborn should not be confusing. And most of the local administrations interpret this law as suggesting that the name should be gender specific. So essentially, no girls' names for boys, no boys' names for girls. If you really want to give a name which is non-gender specific, then you might be forced/encouraged to introduce middle names, which would then indicate gender. But of course, whatever Belgian rules might be, we work in an international context. And this means that relation between the first name and a certain gender might differ on the country or on the culture. So obvious example would be Italian names like Andrea, Simone, and so on, which are associated with men in Italy, but for instance, would be associated with women in countries like Germany. So this is why Gender Computer, that was one of the first name to gender tools that Bogdan has built several years ago, try to take into account location of the developer and use this location to interpret the relation between the first name and the gender. And I'm using here my personal profiles from Stack Overflow and GitHub, not necessarily because I'm the paradigmatic developer, which I'm of course not, but simply because it was very easy for me to obtain consent in showing this. So, and of course, speaking of Stack Overflow or GitHub, we can always add a whole bunch of heuristics Subject location would not necessarily be a name of a country, but it can be a zip code, state, top-level domain. And I guess that you can easily recognize this wonderful bridge. And that's because some people just indicate cities, kind of suggesting that there is only one real San Francisco. So in 2016, we have performed a comparative study of several name-to-gender techniques. So Gender Computer is the one that Bogdan has built. Gender Guesser is one which is publicly available on GitHub. And Josh Terrell et al. Is a technique which has been designed by Josh, and Emerson was one of the authors of this paper. So as a ground truth, we have used information we have obtained through several surveys. So we've been surveying developers for different purposes. We've been asking them all kinds of questions. One of those questions was gender, and another one was their Stack Overflow name. So we have matched those, and we have applied different techniques to see how bad or how good those techniques perform. Unfortunately, the only conclusion we could derive back then was that different data sets require different techniques. So it was not a single technique which would be outperforming other techniques across all the data sets. The only thing which was actually pretty consistent was that if you add more information, so for instance, if you include information not only from Stack Overflow, but also from GitHub, then your precision, then your accuracy of guessing is going up. But this is also not so surprising. But of course, country as a proxy for culture, as a key to interpretation of the relation between the name and a gender, might be problematic. So first of all, just looking around, like many of us don't really live in countries where we have been born. And this is yet another example, Dr. Andrea Capillupi, and we know that Dr. Andrea Capillupi lives in London. What can we say about the gender of this individual? What would you expect the gender of this individual to be?
Professor, male.
Professor. Professor, it's a, you know, plus, plus, plus for the gender list. I need to submit to the open demographics.
Well, the surname kind of throws you off, right?
Right. You know him well. So the surname, right? So this is how, so indeed, in this case, Andrea is not a man. So a tool called NumSource, it's a commercial tool, but it's working on the freemium model. So I would like to encourage all of you to try to play with the tool and see how it does its job. So what it does, so based indeed on Andrea's surname, it tries to infer ethnic background, and then it is this ethnic background rather than location is used to interpret the relation between the first name and the gender. So gender here is inferred as M, Andrea is a man, and NumSource also gives a certain confidence score between -1 and 1. So if NumSource is completely confident that this person is a man, then the score would be -1. If the NumSource is completely confident that the person is a woman, then the score would be 1. Everything in between indicates different degrees of certainty, with 0, of course, meaning the tool has no clue what's going on. So in this particular case, it's -0.5, so the tool is quite confident that Andrea is a man, but not completely. So how far can we get with this? So this is the data I collected yesterday or day before from Stack Overflow. So first of all, 11% of Stack Overflow users have automatically generated names, usernames, things like user 12345. So for user 12345, of course, whatever technique we might have, it will always fail, right? So forget about this gray segment. Tools such as NumSource would typically assume that you have first name and one or more surnames. So for those, well, of course, I cannot check how many people on Stack Overflow actually adhere to this pattern. So I used a very simple heuristics. I just checked for presence of spaces in usernames. So the red part is without spaces. So for the red part, there is no reason a priori to assume that a NumSource would provide any kind of benefits, as opposed to the blue part, which actually separates first name or whatever which we can take as a first name and as a surname. In fact, last year, Lucia Santamaria and Elena Mikhailovich have compared a performance of 5 different name-to-gender inference tools. So their ground truth came from scientific papers. They have collected 7,000 names from papers from PubMed, from World of Science, and similar sources, and then they have manually labeled them to indicate the gender of their interpretation. So what do we see here? So first of all, gender API and genderized IO tend to overpredict women as men and men as women, respectively. So essentially, this means that given a name that the human raters have recognized, for instance, as a name of a woman, gender API will be predicting them, is quite likely to predict it as male. And of course, for genderized IO, it's exactly the other way around. The gender guesser, one of the tools which we also have looked at in 2016, it tend to over-report unknowns. So essentially, all those tools, in addition to saying woman or man, they typically would say, I don't know, either by providing low confidence or by reporting a separate category. And of course, it is very easy to build a guesser which will always say, I don't know. So gender guesser reports unknowns much more often than other tools. Yes?
Unknown, where like it literally can't guess for, and I think it could be both. Like I could like press.
Right, crease, pat, and so on, right? It depends on the tool. In this particular study, they labeled this situation as an A, I don't know, without separating it further. But for instance, already Bogdan's early tool made a distinction between unisex names and indeed lack of any kind of information. Depends on the tool.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, what was the meaning of those numbers? So for instance, error coded, so it's a fraction, right? You take the number of men that have been identified as women by the tool, plus the number of women which have been identified as men by the tool, plus the number of men which have been identified as unknown, plus the number of women which have been identified as unknown, and you divide it by the total number of predictions. That's the first column. The second column is the same, of course, without the unknowns, and the last one is essentially the difference between predictions in 2 directions. Okay, so NumStore seems to perform quite well if you look at the previous picture. But if you look at more carefully at what kind of names are being correctly or incorrectly predicted, then the story becomes completely different. You see that, for instance, for European names, NumStore is doing a great job. You see a very, very small box plot. The median is 1, so it's highly confident in whatever predictions it makes. And even the minimum bar is very, very high. This is not the case for Asian names, and in particular, it's not the case for East Asian names. So for East Asian names, we have half of the answers, so 50% of the answers getting confidence of 0. So median is extremely low. The situation for Southeast Asian names is slightly better, but still the spread is huge. And this is a problem when we want to analyze software developers, because there are many East Asian software developers. So for instance, it's a recent survey from StackerFlow, which says that we have 6% of East Asian developers. And we are most likely to have even more software developers with East Asian names, not necessarily living in the East Asian region. And in fact, the 2019 study of developer population suggests that Asia-Pacific, East Asia-Pacific, is the most rapidly growing region when it comes to the number of software developers. So essentially making our tools kind of sustainable towards the future would require understanding East Asian names as well. So this is why, yes?
So while everyone in the West is really preoccupied with the idea
So the question that Andy is asking is whether the topic of gender equality is equally important in East Asia as it's important in the West. I think it depends on countries. Katie, you want to comment on this? Right. So, but again, even to answer your question, we need to have some idea of the gender of the individuals involved, right? So we need to be, if we want to use this kind of tools, then the tools have to be able to take East Asian names into account. So this is why in our recent work with Bogdan's group at Carnegie Mellon, we have explicitly included East Asian names in our training data. So what have we done? We have used the gender computer, which is the old tools that Bogdan has developed in the past. We mentioned it already. NumSOR, which is a commercial tool we talked about. And we have added some more specific name related features, such as two last characters. And the reason, for instance, why we want to look at the two last characters is because in Japan, names that end on ko, tend to be associated with women. So we trained our classifier. It's a binary classifier with all the implications of this. And if you look at the performance of the classifier, then you see that it is significantly outperforming both gender computer and NumSOR, in particular when it comes to Chinese and Korean names. In fact, we have reported this finding to NumSOR, and NumSOR is currently redesigning their machinery related to Chinese names. Another part of information which we as software developers tend to expose on platforms such as Stack Overflow and GitHub is, of course, a profile picture. This means that facial recognition techniques can be applied to infer gender of an individual. So this is, again, my picture, and one of those tools called Facelitics has successfully identified that I'm a man. It is a bit off when it comes to age, but well, better this way than another way. Unfortunately, it's not always working that well. The person in the picture this time is Daniela Petruzalek, who is a software developer and who is a transgender software developer. So here we see that the upper part indicates that this person is a man, so misgenders the person, and the lower one correctly identifies her gender as a woman. And it's, of course, the very same person. It is just a different picture from the very same person. I have to say that I checked several profiles of transgender software developers whom I either know personally or I heard about at least. The results are not as bad. I mean, it's not that for every single one I checked, you get inconsistent results. Mostly, the tool is doing fine, but by far not always. And again, it was not a formal study, so that's why I don't want to put any kind of percentages on it. And of course, again, application of this kind of techniques to popular data sets such as Stack Overflow and GitHub would require us to understand how often people actually put their face pictures on their profiles. So on Stack Overflow, it turns out that roughly 30% of the profile images are auto-generated, which is essentially MD5 hash of the email, which has somehow been visualized as blobs. So there is no way, again, to infer any kind of personally identifiable information from it. But even if you look at images which have not been auto-generated, it's not necessarily that they represent people. You can see your favorite cat pictures, but you can also see logos of companies and whatnot. So we have composed a collection of 900 images which have not been automatically generated. And we try to spread it a little bit over different reputations, because Stack Overflow privileges are related to reputation, and across different ages, because also there we kind of expected age-related phenomena. And then the mandatory card sorting slide. Essentially, 53% of those pictures represented human beings. Again, we don't really know whether those are the human beings they are supposed to be, but at least they are human beings rather than cartoon characters, company logos, or whatever. When it comes to the artifacts created by software developers, meaning questions on Stack Overflow, comments on GitHub, or source code, then of course we can try to look at the text-to-gender identification techniques. The recent survey from Stefan Krüger and Ben Herman has focused on text-to-gender identification techniques published in the last 2 years. And as you obviously see, most of the research went on identification of gender of Twitter contributors. And if it's not about Twitter, which is, for instance, the case for the last work, which also achieved the highest accuracy across the data sets, it was about journalist posts, and it was related to the novels. So the primary reason why people want to do this kind of identification is not even about gender, but about authorship. So they want to identify who has written this piece of text because of plagiarism or because of literature-related mysteries, such as the story of Elena Ferrante. It's not completely clear to what extent those, the features that they are typically using when predicting gender are related to the linguistic structure of the text. So things like number of nouns, or things like a number of adjectives, or number of words per sentence. There they see differences in writing style of women and men. It is not completely clear whether this kind of features can be transferred to technical writing. At least I have never seen a serious attempt to do it. But if you know about this kind of work, then please tell me. Again, we have tried to use some of those tools to apply some of those tools to Stack Overflow questions, and the results were all over the place. Of course, when we tried to do it, it was several years ago, so by now, hopefully the tools are better, but I don't see any indication of applications of this kind of tools to software engineering texts, let alone to code. In any case, when we are trying to use automatic gender inference techniques based on names, based on text, based on faces, we need to keep in mind the limitations. And the first and obvious limitation is accuracy. So you see that Krüger and Herman for the text to gender report 62 to 93% of accuracy. And the work of Sophie Chu for those names to text was referring to 60 to 84% of accuracy. So this means that risk of misgendering an individual software developer is very, very high. The question again is, what do we do with it? If our goal is to understand differences in experiences or behavior of different gender in the software engineering domain, then maybe one particular misclassification does not affect validity of our conclusions. Maybe we can design our follow-up experiment or our follow-up statistical analysis in such a way to take the loss of accuracy into account. Of course, if we are trying to make any kind of conclusions at the level of an individual, then it's where it becomes extremely problematic. The next point is reliability. And this is a quote from one of our surveys from 2015. Right? So I'll just read it for the case of Googlers who are online. I have used a fake GitHub handle. My normal GitHub handle is my first name, which is distinctly female name, so that people would assume I was male. So all those automatic techniques, of course, assume that whatever people say is truth. But again, for many, many reasons, people might prefer not to tell the truth. And finally, a major issue here is gender binary. So Krüger and Herman, for their text-to-gender techniques, all of those text-to-gender techniques assume gender binary. The study of Oz case for the face-to-gender techniques have observed that more than 90% of the techniques that they have surveyed assume gender binary. And this percentage of 20% of the named gender techniques in the study of Santa Maria and Mihaljevic looks much better, but it is not. Essentially, what this means that among the 5 tools they have surveyed, only one was only saying woman or man. All the rest were giving a percentage, but this percentage is more a percentage of confidence rather than any kind of attempt to capture experiences of people who are neither women or men. So whatever techniques we use, whether we are using automatic techniques or whether we are using questioning, we need to keep in mind that they have their limitations. The main limitation of interviews and surveys, of course, just scale, but then it allows us to get more rich information. The main limitation of automatic gender detection techniques is the oversimplification of the concept of gender, but then it allows us to get scalability. So I would like to, essentially I would like to spend the remaining part of the talk by a call for action and show some first results which we achieved in that direction. So I would like to encourage us as a research community to look at 2 topics. And one is indeed looking at genders which are not women and men. I'm going to talk about some of the first results we obtained in a moment. And the second one, which is a topic which has already been mentioned yesterday, is that gender should not be considered as the only variable in our model. And this is partly because the notion of gender is culturally dependent, and partly because gender and other variables such as age or culture or whatever tend to interact. At the gender equality workshop at ICSI, there was a study of Finnish women who are considering career switch to IT. And several concerns which have been raised by the participants were exactly on this interaction, on this intersection between gender and age. I am 36, the training program takes 2 years, I will be 38, who wants to hire me, right? So this is exactly this gender and age intersection. So we started looking into the genders beyond binary. So this is a joint work with Dinae Ford from North Carolina State and Reed Milevich from Sandia National Labs. So we have conducted 3 semi-structured interviews with software engineers who identify as transgender women. And we talked about things like identity management in the workplace, like specific binaries they experience on the platforms they involved on, safety, and so on. So we have reviewed those recordings, we have compared themes, we have interpreted the data, we checked with them whether our interpretation is correct. We have looked at open blogs and posts of other transgender women who are software developers to try to collect additional support for our themes. And we have finally done the member check of this entire thing with one of the friendly developers who agreed to do it. So one of the first topics which emerged from this entire process is the control of identity disclosure. So on the left, you have a quote from one of our interviews. On the right, you have a statement from Daniela Petrozalek, whose name has already been mentioned. So control of identity disclosure simply means the desire to be seen as presenting. And platforms can be very different in supporting this desire or curbing this desire. For instance, Stack Overflow is very flexible in this respect. It allows you as an individual to determine what do you tell, how much do you tell, and how do you tell. As opposed to it, GitHub used, not anymore, used to expose your email address. And exposing email address might be problematic. I already quoted this software developer who said that they created a fake handle because the original one was related to their first name. And of course, given the current atmosphere, both in online platforms and in companies, depending on the country and so on, if you are not possible, so essentially if you cannot be interpreted by other people as the gender you want to present, you might be easily become target of hate, of all kinds of horrible behavior, and so on and so forth. So possibilities, so this ability to present as gender that you want to present is not only because you want, but it's also the matter of self-preservation. The second topic was related to economically stable work. And here I need to say that transgender Americans are much, much more likely to experience poverty, to experience unemployment, and ultimately homelessness than their cisgender counterparts. The differences are enormous. So technology can help here by, for instance, through this means of tools like Bounty Source. So Bounty Source, if you don't know, it's a website when you can perform programming tasks and being paid for it. It's a kind of gig platform. So one of our interviewees said that one cannot tell based on the technical profile that they are transgender. So it's again partly related to disclosure of identity, but also it's partly related to ability to be engaged in economical activity. And Angelica Ross, who is yet another transgender software developer, well-known software developer, said that technology has leveled the playing field for them. So essentially this means that people like Angelica Ross, or actually everybody, can spend their own time developing the skill, which might not necessarily be the case in more traditional collocated setting. In fact, it turns out that this topic of control of identity disclosure, of economically stable work, and of autonomy to disengage or re-engage, the topic I have not discussed, is related to remote work. Technology has allowed many people to work remotely. Sometimes companies encourage, facilitate, or at least allow their regular employees to work remotely. We have platforms such as Bounty Source, which are purely built on the concept of remote work. And in fact, we believe that remote work can be beneficial as a mechanism to control identity disclosure and empower any kind of minority groups, not necessarily transgender women who we have interviewed. And I would like to compare this remote work, this discussion of remote work. There is a wonderful, wonderful example that has been given by Margaret Burnett. So this is a picture from Amsterdam. I decided to put in my presentation both the country I live in, Belgium, and the country I work in, the Netherlands. So there is a technological solution here which has been designed for people who are using wheelchairs. But of course, it can be equally well beneficial for people with strollers, with wheelers, this kind of luggage on wheels, or maybe those who ride a tricycle. So while the technology itself has been designed for one specific group, it can benefit much broader population. So to summarize, in order to understand experience of people of different genders in the software engineering context, we need to identify their genders. It sounds kind of obvious, but this is essentially the reason why we are doing all this work. We need to keep in mind that gender is privacy sensitive, and there might be numerous very valid reasons that people or organizations don't want to disclose it. If we are trying to identify gender, whether through surveys and interviews or by automatically analyzing large amounts of data, we need to understand that essentially none of those techniques is perfect, and whatever you are doing it wrong. But it should not discourage us from doing things, because this is the way we can understand at least some part of the complexity of gender-related experiences in the software engineering realm, and hopefully the insights we can infer can not only benefit people about whom we are talking in the first place, but the software developers community in the broader sense. Thank you.
Questions?
This is really cool. Thank you for the presentation. It's amazing. I had a couple of questions. So one is, you mentioned the issue of people using fake handles. Do you have a sense of how prevalent that is? Or
So
is there any work
so
on
the
that?
question was how prevalent the usage of fake handle is. It is extremely tough to answer it, right? First of all, of course, we need to figure out that it's fake. And second, and you need to do it extremely, extremely fast. Because of course, the moment the moderator of the website gets to the same conclusion, then this profile will be removed. So it is a little bit, we talked about violations of code of conduct yesterday. It's of course not the same, but it's a kind of similar in a sense. It's a violation of the rule, and this means that it's not being shown. At some point, we have looked at the literature on the online poker communities. So and poker is of course all about bluff, right? So what was going on there, the argument they've been putting forward is that if I'm a man and I essentially don't want my counterparts to take me too seriously, I will just say that I'm a woman, I'm a beginner, you know, I'm not such a good player, don't put your best cards against me, right? If on the other hand, I'm a woman and I want to say I'm the best player ever, fear me, then I will pretend to be a man. It might be that something similar works for Stack Overflow, for instance. So if I'm a student of any gender and I'm fearing that my question can be shut down because it's homework or because it's stupid or whatever, I might prefer to present as a woman for this particular question. Not clear. That's very conjectural. Yes.
Hi, thank you. Actually, first a comment. I'm a proud faculty member at Oregon State, not NCSU.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Copy-paste errors will happen. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem. Let's see here. I didn't want people to think I was moving. I would never leave Oregon State. Okay, the second thing is, though, I think it's really important in a situation like this for us to all really think hard about the social aspects of this. And so, you know, we're all here because we care about doing the right thing from an equity perspective. And so in trying to automatically figure things out, I think one of the dimensions we really have to think about seriously is the permanence of whatever techniques we're talking about. So for example, a great thing about the questionnaire approach is that whatever you can figure out from it is temporary, because the questionnaire doesn't live on somebody's site. But on the other hand, you know, developing wonderful new ways to infer gender from facial recognition or from first names and last names and text content and that sort of thing, that's permanent. That can be easily misused by nefarious people for nefarious things. So my bottom line is, I think we have to think about permanence as one of the dimensions of evaluating various approaches that we might want to pursue.
So thank you very much for this comment. In fact, in the paper of Oskis that I already cited, when one of them comments on this gender binary and the facial recognition techniques was made, other attributes this person they were talking about were related to physiological basis for gender recognition and immutability. So exactly the fact that gender is being captured as something which one cannot change. And in a way, one might wonder what would happen if we would apply even our techniques to historical data, which is exactly what we are doing in the repository mining community. Do we see any kind of evolution there, or is the things are going to be broken and whatever? And again, also there, anecdotal evidence suggests that, for instance, when software developers transition, they ask platforms such as GitHub to rename their handle and immediately create a new handle with the old name. And this is because if you have been working with me and I'm transitioning and using a new name forward, you might still recall my old name. So there are all kinds of coping strategies. Sorry.
So great talk, and I really like that we're able to decipher genders, but I also wonder, like, what's the ethical implications of doing this, like finding gender from the pictures or finding gender from the handles, right? We are trying to do it for a good cause, so we believe, but there are ethical implications, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is why I'm saying whatever we are doing with respect to gender, we are doing it wrong. So just start with this, like, you know, this is why we can, publishing this kind of tools is problematic. At the same time, those tools are continuously emerging. I've been checking, last week, I easily found something like 30 different tools on GitHub, derived from whatever sources. And the goal of those tools is, of course, gender-specific marketing, not so much, or gender-specific personalization of whatever user interfaces, right? It's not so much about research. So in a way, and again, can we talk about ethical concerns in the tool, or can we talk about ethical concerns of the application of the tool? But I am agreeing that we need to think about it.
So, Alexander, so we use Bogdan's tool to classify the gender of developers of the Linux kernel. One thing that is interesting is the following, and I think that there's two types of research. One that wants us to see the people as individuals, and there I think is acceptable. But when you want to measure the contributions of those individuals, just one error might completely offset the results, just one error. So, and I think that what I'm starting to see in a lot of research is that people are using these tools to quantify effort, and they're not even thinking about the error that they might actually incur.
I completely agree. So this is why, for instance, when we've been doing this work, we try to manually check at least the most influential contributors. This is, for instance, also what Bitergia was doing for the OpenStack Foundation when they asked the community to verify what is going on. So one error, yes, but it depends on the kind of error, right? If you are looking at somebody who has made one contribution of 2 lines of code, then maybe the misgendering this person is not going to affect validity of your conclusion. If it's a primary, if it's a main contributor, then yes. So yes and no.
We'll take one more question.
Alexander, you mentioned that self-identification of gender is important, and there are techniques like conducting surveys or interviews. But how helpful is this when it's pretty much the other people in the team who are perceiving it, and what they will perceive may not be what you self-identify? So what are your thoughts? Like, how useful is it?
So you're asking about the difference between gender as gender identity and gender as being perceived by other people. Yeah. This was exactly the topic of possibility that Daniela Petruzalek was talking about, essentially being able to be perceived as the way you identify. And this is exactly one of the advantages of remote work and computer-mediated collaborative work, the fact that you can assert your identity much stronger than in the face-to-face context. Whether it is important, it's of course for each one to decide. But given the continuous struggle of transgender individuals for acceptance, I can only conjecture that it is